You are about to witness a story that will reveal the true power of justice and courage. Today, we will follow the journey of a doctor who was humiliated by police officers in a restaurant, but who, with the support of his brother, turned this pain into a powerful fight for justice. This story is a reminder to us all that, even in the face of injustice, we can find the strength to fight and change the world around us. But what you will see is how a hidden truth came to light and turned the tables in a surprising way. Get ready to understand the power of courage and truth, and how it can inspire your own journey. Keep watching and discover how a family united by faith and justice can transform society. If you believe that God is by your side in every battle, write "God is my strength" in the comments. Eli's restaurant was impeccably lit, every detail carefully thought out to create an atmosphere of elegance and exclusivity. The tables were covered with white linen tablecloths, and the soft candlelight created golden reflections in the crystal glasses. The muffled sound of animated conversations and the clink of wine glasses filled the air with vibrant energy. Marcus, wearing an impeccable black suit, felt on top of the world. At 45, he had achieved a significant milestone in his medical career, a breakthrough that promised to change the way chronic diseases were treated. His colleagues, all present to celebrate, surrounded him with smiles and toasts. It was an evening of recognition, where every look and word exchanged carried admiration and respect for him. As he looked around the room, Marcus felt a wave of satisfaction. He remembered the long hours of study, the sleepless nights, and the challenges he had faced to get there. This moment was the reward for all his dedication. He raised his glass, ready to toast his success, when the restaurant door opened abruptly. Two policemen entered, their heavy boots echoing on the marble floor. The chatter in the room died down, and curious eyes turned to the officers who were advancing in earnest. Marcus felt a slight unease, but ignored it, focusing once again on his colleagues. However, the feeling of something wrong persisted, and he couldn't help but notice when the officers began to look around, as if they were searching for someone. They stopped next to his desk. "Sir, we need to see your ID," said one of the officers, his voice firm, but with an underlying tone of questioning authority. The atmosphere, which a few moments ago had been filled with joy, now seemed to carry a new weight. Marcus looked at the faces around him, all waiting for his reaction. He remained calm, although he could feel the discomfort beginning to spread through his thoughts. Marcus felt his heart beating a little faster, but he kept his composure. With a controlled movement, he took his wallet out of his pocket and handed his ID to the officer. The officer took it with a neutral expression, but there was something about the way he held the document, a cursory glance that seemed to judge more than simply verify. "Do you work here, sir?" the officer asked, handing the document back with a slightly arched eyebrow. "No, I'm here to have dinner with my colleagues," replied Marcus, his voice firm but polite. The policeman kept his gaze fixed on Marcus for a moment longer than necessary, before finally taking a step back. "All right, sir. Sorry for the interruption." However, the tone in his voice suggested that the words were far from a sincere apology. Marcus watched as the policeman walked away, but the feeling of unease remained. What was supposed to be a night of celebration had been disrupted by an experience that, although brief, left a bitter taste in his mouth. He knew that what had just happened wasn't just a routine check. Something else was behind that encounter, something that made his stomach churn in a subtle but persistent way. The smiles of his colleagues around him seemed a little more strained, the conversation slowly returning, but with a noticeable hesitation. Marcus tried to rejoin the celebration, but felt the growing pressure of an evening that he was beginning to realize would not end as well as it had begun. As the evening wore on, he tried hard to ignore the incident, trying to immerse himself in the conversations and laughter that resumed around him. However, the shadow of what had happened hung over him, making it impossible for him to fully enjoy the evening. Marcus knew that, somehow, this was just the start of something bigger, and the uneasy feeling inside him continued to grow. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt you were unfairly judged? Share your experience in the comments below, and tell us how you dealt with it. The night went on, but the discomfort Marcus felt didn't go away. He tried to concentrate on his colleagues' conversations, But the image of the policemen and their questions wouldn't leave his mind. Everything seemed to return to normal, until suddenly he saw, out of the corner of his eye, the same two policemen returning to the hall. This time, the tension was palpable. They walked straight up to the table where Marcus was sitting, their expressions now harder, without disguising the discomfort they intended to cause. The surrounding conversations fell silent again, and all eyes turned to them, curiosity and concern on their faces. "Sir, we need you to come with us for a brief chat," said the policeman, his voice firm but carrying a tone that suggested this was no simple request. "But what's the problem, officer?" Marcus asked, trying to remain calm as a wave of anxiety surged through his chest. "We've received a report about a suspicious person here. We need to clarify a few points," the officer replied, looking away from Marcus to the others at the table. "It won't take long." Marcus felt the heavy gaze of everyone present on him. A mixture of anger and indignation began to simmer inside him, but he knew he had to keep control. He stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the expectations and judgments around him. He was aware that for many, his presence there was being questioned in a way that no one else in the room would have to face. "I didn't do anything wrong," said Marcus, his voice carrying a firmness that he wasn't entirely sure he felt. "It's just a routine procedure, sir," replied the other policeman, gesturing for Marcus to follow him. Marcus exchanged one last look with his colleagues before getting out of his chair. The table was filled with a mixture of concern and disbelief, but no one dared to say a word. He walked with the policeman to a far corner of the restaurant, where the lights were dimmer and the atmosphere seemed even heavier. There, away from everyone's gaze, he began an interrogation which, although disguised as formality, was steeped in prejudice and hostility. The questions were direct, but carried a veiled insinuation, as if he was being accused of something without the accusation being clearly formulated. "Are you sure you're here for legitimate reasons?" asked one of the policemen, with a wry smile that made Marcus's blood run cold. The public humiliation he was suffering at that moment was like an invisible blow, but just as painful as a physical one. Marcus knew that this was a test of his dignity, and with every answer he gave, he felt he was being forced to prove something he should never have to prove. If you have ever seen or faced a situation like this, please like this video to show that we are not alone in the fight against injustice. Marcus felt the weight of the humiliation building up layer by layer, as the police officer's questions became increasingly personal and invasive. With every answer he gave, he realized that no matter what he said, the police had already formed their opinions. They were there not to seek the truth, but to reaffirm an unfounded suspicion that fed their own prejudices. As the interrogation continued, Marcus could see, from a distance, the restaurant manager approaching, his worried face reflecting the tension in the room. "Excuse me, gentlemen," said the manager, his voice polite but firm. "This is a respected customer of our restaurant. Is there a problem?" One of the policemen turned to the manager, his expression unchanged. "We're just doing our job. Nothing you need to worry about." Marcus watched the manager hesitate for a moment, as if pondering what he should do next. He knew that, as manager, his obligation was to keep the peace in the establishment, but he also knew that Marcus was being treated unfairly. "I understand," said the manager, trying to remain calm, "but I can assure you that Dr. Marcus is a man of integrity. There's no need for any further questions." "We're following procedures, sir," the policeman retorted, his tone colder. "Now, if you could let us continue." The manager took a step back, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but without any more arguments to intervene. Marcus felt frustration growing inside him. He knew that if he didn't do something, the humiliation would continue, and perhaps even get worse. Taking a deep breath, Marcus decided that enough was enough. He raised his head, met the gaze of the police officer who was questioning him, and, with a firm voice, declared, "This is unacceptable. I'm here to celebrate an important achievement in my career, not to be treated like a criminal. I demand respect and dignity." The silence that followed was heavy, almost palpable. The policemen exchanged glances, surprised by Marcus' sudden assertiveness. For a moment, no one moved, The tension in the air was so thick that it seemed almost suffocating. Finally, one of the policemen took a step back, as if to retreat, but not before casting one last contemptuous glance. "We're watching you," he said, with a slightly threatening tone, before turning and leaving the restaurant. Marcus remained where he was, his body tense, but his mind clear. He knew that night would never be the same. The dignity he had fought so hard to maintain had been put to the test, and he had defended it in the only way he knew how, by facing injustice head-on. He returned to the table, his colleagues staring at him in silence, still shocked by what they had witnessed. Marcus sat down, but the bitter taste of humiliation remained. The celebration was over for him, but the fight for his dignity had only just begun. Would you like to see more stories about courage and overcoming? Subscribe to our channel so you don't miss any of our inspiring videos. The night stretched like a long, heavy shadow as Marcus walked towards his home. The cold air of the fall night enveloped him, but what really bothered him was the coldness he felt inside. Every step seemed to echo the weight of what had happened. The public humiliation he had suffered replaying in his mind like a movie he couldn't stop watching. Arriving home, Marcus felt the familiarity of the place, try to offer some comfort. The living room, with its simple but elegant furniture, the lights softly illuminating the corners, felt like a refuge, but the feeling of unease persisted. He took off his coat and threw it over the sofa, sinking into his favorite armchair. He looked around, trying to find something to distract him, but all he saw was a reflection of his own thoughts. The clock on the wall ticked away the hours slowly, each second seeming like a relentless reminder of the night he wanted to forget. The voice of the policeman, the hesitation of his colleagues, the look in the restaurant manager's eyes, everything blended into a cacophony of feelings that he couldn't silence. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees and running his hands over his face, trying to shake off the feeling of helplessness. Marcus knew that night wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of something much bigger, something he had been facing all his life. But this time, the humiliation had been public, laid bare in front of everyone, and that made him even more upset. He stood up slowly, walking over to the window. Outside, the city lights shone, indifferent to what he was feeling. Life went on as usual, but Marcus knew that something inside him had changed. He could no longer ignore what had happened, and more importantly, he couldn't allow it to go unanswered. He went back into the living room and sat down again, this time with a resolution that was beginning to take shape. This wasn't just going to be another bitter night in his memory. It was going to be the starting point for something bigger. He needed to act, and he knew exactly who to turn to. Marcus glanced at his watch once more before picking up the phone. He knew it was late, but there was one person he needed to talk to right now. He dialed the number with trembling fingers, and after a few rings, the familiar voice of his brother Thomas answered on the other end. "Marcus, what happened? Are you all right?" The concern in Thomas's voice was immediate, reflecting the deep connection between the two brothers. "Thomas, I was humiliated today in a restaurant," Marcus began, his voice still laden with the tension of the night. He then told the story, every painful detail of the interaction with the policeman, the invasive questions, and the way his dignity had been publicly questioned. Thomas listened in silence, but Marcus could feel his brother's growing anger through the phone. When he had finished, there was a pause before Thomas finally spoke. "This is unacceptable, Marcus. They can't treat you like this. You're a respected doctor, a good citizen, and what they did was purely racist. We can't let it go." Marcus knew that Thomas, a renowned civil rights lawyer, would not let the situation go unpunished. The determination in his brother's voice brought him a mixed feeling of relief and guilt. Relief for knowing that Thomas was willing to fight for him, but guilt for involving his brother in something he himself only wished to forget. "I know, Thomas, but I'm tired. Tired of having to prove my humanity at every turn," Marcus admitted, his voice low. "I understand, Marcus, but that's exactly why we can't leave it at that. They need to be held accountable for what they've done. I'm going to start working on that tomorrow. We're going to expose this injustice and make sure it doesn't happen again, to you or anyone else." Marcus took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the decision he was about to make. He knew that moving forward would mean a long and exhausting battle, but he also knew that, with Thomas by his side, he wasn't alone. "All right, Thomas, let's do it," Marcus replied, feeling a new determination growing inside him. "Good. Rest tonight, Marcus. Tomorrow we start the fight. And don't worry, we're in this together," said Thomas, his voice full of conviction. After hanging up the phone, Marcus felt some of the weight on his shoulders lighten. He was no longer just surviving humiliation. Now, he was willing to fight it. And with his brother by his side, he knew he had a real chance of making a difference. Do you have someone in your life who always supports you in the most difficult times? The next morning, Marcus woke up with a renewed sense of purpose. The sunlight coming through the curtains of his window seemed less heavy, as if the conversation with Thomas the night before had cleared not only his thoughts, but also his path forward. He stood up, feeling determination warm him from the inside out. He knew that what had happened the night before was more than an isolated incident. It was a reflection of the injustices that he, as a black man, had faced throughout his life. But this time he wasn't willing to let it go. It was time to act. After getting dressed and having a quick coffee, he picked up the phone and called his brother. Thomas was already in full swing, just as Marcus had hoped. "Good morning, Marcus. I hope you've been resting because we have a lot of work to do today," said Thomas, his voice firm and decisive without a trace of hesitation. Marcus felt a wave of gratitude for having such a committed brother by his side. "I'm ready. What do you need me to do?" he replied, determined to go ahead with the plan. Thomas explained that the first step would be to gather support from the community and the activist networks he was already working with. "We're going to need the strength of many voices to make this situation get the attention it deserves," Thomas explained. "The more people who stand with us, the harder it will be for them to ignore what has happened." Marcus knew this was a smart strategy. He had seen before what a united community could do, and he was determined to see it happen again. Marcus spent the rest of the morning contacting colleagues, friends, and acquaintances, sharing what had happened the night before. He was no longer ashamed of what had happened. On the contrary, he now used this experience as a call to action. Each time he told the story, he felt more empowered, as if the words were an armor against the injustice he had faced. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Messages of support and solidarity started pouring in from all sides, with many offering to help in any way they could. Meanwhile, Thomas was in contact with community leaders, lawyers, and activists. He knew the right people, those who could not only make a noise, but make a real impact. Within hours, a meeting was organized for that afternoon at the headquarters of a local civil rights organization. When Marcus arrived at the meeting, he was surprised by the number of people who showed up. The room was full, and the murmur of conversation indicated the indignation shared by everyone there. It was clear that what had happened to Marcus had touched a nerve in the whole community. Thomas took the floor, his voice carrying authority and conviction. "We are here today because what happened to my brother Marcus is unacceptable. He has been humiliated and treated like a criminal because of the color of his skin, and this cannot continue. We need to act, and we need to act now." Thomas's words echoed around the room, and the response was immediate. People began discussing ideas and action plans, each determined to be part of the solution. The room responded with nods and murmurs of approval. The discussion then turned to actions that could be taken to draw attention to the case. Peaceful protests, petitions, and media coverage were some of the ideas thrown around. There was an electricity in the air, a feeling that something important was about to happen. Leaders, and we also need the media to be there to cover the event and make sure the message is heard. Marcus, who until then had remained silent, finally spoke up. "I thank you all for being here and for being willing to fight alongside me. I know that this is not just my fight, but all of ours. Let's show them that we are not alone and that our voice is strong." The meeting ended with a solid action plan, and Marcus felt invigorated by the energy and support of the community. He knew that the road ahead would be difficult, but he also knew that there was something bigger at stake, something worth fighting for. In the days that followed, Marcus and Thomas immersed themselves deeply in preparing for the battle to come. Thomas, with his vast experience in civil rights cases, began compiling evidence and investigating the backgrounds of the police officers involved in the incident. It wasn't long before they discovered something alarming. Those same officers had already been the subject of other complaints for inappropriate behavior, but somehow the previous investigations had never led to serious consequences. This discovery further fueled Thomas's determination. "Marcus, what happened to you is not an isolated case. These men have a pattern of behavior, and we need to expose it to the public," he said, with a glint of determination in his eyes. Marcus agreed. "This needs to be brought to light. We can't allow them to continue acting with impunity." With the help of local journalists and activists, Thomas managed to put together an impressive collection of documents proving the misconduct of the police officers. They included testimonies from other victims, internal police department records, and even some audio recordings that had somehow escaped destruction. In a strategic move, Thomas and Marcus decided to hold a press conference to publicize their findings. The press conference was scheduled for a Saturday, in the same place where they had held the community meeting. Word spread quickly, and on the morning of the event, the room was packed with journalists, activists, and community members. Marcus was nervous, but he also felt an inner strength that he had never experienced before. When he took the stage next to Thomas, he felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders, but also the support of everyone around him. Thomas began the press conference with a forceful introduction. "Today, we are here to reveal to the public what has been hidden for far too long. The misconduct of the police officers who humiliated my brother Marcus is not an isolated incident. It is part of a pattern of abuse of power that needs to be stopped." He then went on to present the evidence they had gathered. As the documents and recordings were revealed, the room was gripped by a wave of shock and outrage. The evidence was clear and undeniable, and the murmurs of the journalists made it clear that the story would be widely publicized. When it was Marcus' turn to speak, he took a deep breath and faced the crowd. "What happened to me was not just an act of racism. It was a violation of my rights as a citizen, and unfortunately, it's something that happens to many others who don't have a voice. I'm here today to say that this needs to stop. I'm not just asking for justice for myself, but for all those who have experienced this." The room erupted in applause, and Marcus felt a wave of emotion wash over him. He knew that this was only the first of many battles, but he also knew that they had taken a big step in the right direction. The press conference was a success, and soon after it ended, the story began to be broadcast on all the main news channels. The impact was immediate, and the local authorities were forced to respond to the accusations. The police department announced an internal investigation, but Marcus and Thomas knew they would have to keep pushing to ensure justice was done. As they left the press conference, Marcus looked at his brother and said, "We're just getting started, Thomas. Let's go all the way." Thomas nodded with a determined smile. "I wouldn't expect anything less. We're all in the fight for a fair world. If you believe in justice, share this video with your friends and help spread this message." The pressure on the police department increased every day. The release of the evidence by the media, combined with the protests organized by the community, put the authorities up against the wall. Marcus and Thomas knew they were close to a turning point. The whole city seemed to breathe with the expectation that something big was about to happen. The once quiet streets were now the scene of peaceful but emotionally charged demonstrations. People of all ages and backgrounds joined in a unison chorus, demanding justice and transparency. Finally, after weeks of mounting tension, the police department was forced to speak out publicly. A hearing was scheduled so that the charges against the officers could be formally investigated. The event would be open to the public, and all eyes were on that moment. Marcus, Thomas, and several members of the community attended the hearing, which was packed with journalists, activists, and ordinary citizens. Everyone there knew that what was at stake was not just Marcus' case, but the future of an entire city. When the accused police officers entered the room, Marcus felt the air become heavier. The silence that fell over the audience was almost tangible, as if everyone was holding their breath, waiting for events to unfold. He watched them as they took their seats, their defiant expressions now replaced by a visible tension. They knew that the situation had changed and that they were now being judged not only by their superiors, but by the watchful eye of the entire community. Thomas, representing Marcus, meticulously presented the evidence, unmasking the police officer's pattern of abuse of power. Each document, each recording, each testimony was a piece in the puzzle that exposed the corruption that had been buried beneath the surface for so long. Marcus, sitting next to Thomas, felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. Relief at finally seeing the truth come out, and anxiety about what was to come. The climax of the hearing came when an unexpected witness stood up to speak. He was an ex-policeman, now retired, who had worked with the accused. He confirmed everything that had been presented and, with a trembling voice, revealed that he had been pressured to remain silent about the misconduct he had witnessed over the years. "I couldn't carry this weight any longer," he said, his voice breaking. "These men betrayed the oath they took to protect and serve. It's time they paid for it." The silence in the room was absolute. Everyone was absorbing the impact of the ex-policeman's words. Marcus felt a lump forming in his throat, but at the same time, a sense of relief began to emerge. He knew that this was the turning point. The police officers, visibly shaken, couldn't keep their composure, and soon one of them confessed to planting evidence and manipulating testimony on more than one occasion. The confession was like an explosion that shook the room. The audience reacted with murmurs of shock, while Thomas used the moment to reinforce the need for a complete overhaul of the police department. "What we've heard here today is just the tip of the iceberg," said Thomas, his voice firm and full of conviction. "We need real change so that this kind of abuse never happens again." When the hearing was over, the sense of victory was palpable, but Marcus knew that the work was far from over. He and Thomas had exposed the truth, but now they needed to ensure that the promises of change were kept. As they left the courthouse, Marcus was approached by several members of the community, who congratulated him and expressed their support. Thomas, standing next to him, put his hand on his shoulder and smiled. "You did it, Marcus. This is the first of many victories." Marcus nodded, feeling the weight of the day finally begin to dissipate. "Yes, we did it. But let's make sure it really makes a difference," he replied with renewed determination. He knew that this was only the beginning of a long journey for justice. With the victory at the hearing, Marcus and Thomas found themselves at the center of a wave of change that began to sweep the city. The officers' confession and the exposure of their corrupt actions triggered a series of internal investigations throughout the police department, and several reforms were announced to ensure that abuses of power like those would never happen again. The community, once divided and fearful, was now united in a powerful movement for justice and equality. Over the next few days, the news spread quickly, not only in the city, but throughout the region. Marcus' case became a symbol of the fight against injustice, and other victims of abuse began to come forward, courageously sharing their stories. Marcus, who had previously been seen as just another victim, was now celebrated as a hero, someone who had the courage to stand up to the system and demand change. This recognition, while gratifying, also brought with it a great responsibility. One afternoon, while walking through the city, Marcus was stopped by a young man who thanked him for his courage. "What you did showed us that we can fight for our rights. You've given us all a voice," said the young man. His face lit up with genuine admiration. Marcus was touched by these words, feeling the weight of the expectations of all those who now looked up to him as a leader. "I'm glad to hear it," Marcus replied, with a smile that reflected both gratitude and humility. "But remember, the fight belongs to all of us. We can't stop now. We need to keep fighting for a fairer world." When Marcus arrived home, he found Thomas waiting for him in the living room. "I've got good news," said Thomas, getting up to greet his brother. "The city council has just announced the creation of a civil rights commission to monitor the actions of the police, and they want you to be part of it." Marcus was silent for a moment, absorbing what he had just heard. The creation of a civil rights commission was a significant victory, proof that their struggle was beginning to bear fruit. "That's incredible," he said, still a little surprised. "I never imagined things would come to this." "It only happened because you had the courage to stand up and fight," replied Thomas, his voice full of pride. "And now, you have the chance to continue making a difference, to ensure that the changes we started really happen." Marcus nodded, feeling the magnitude of the responsibility he was being offered. "I accept. Let's make sure that what we started here continues to grow," he said, with a new determination. He knew that setting up the commission was only the beginning, that there was a lot of work to be done, but he also knew that, with Thomas by his side, nothing was impossible. In the days that followed, Marcus took up his new role on the commission, working tirelessly to promote justice and equality. He met with community leaders, authorities, and civil rights experts, discussing strategies to ensure that abuses of power were rooted out and that the police truly served the community. The fight was far from over, but he was more determined than ever to ensure that the changes were real and lasting. The outcome of that night in the restaurant had become a catalyst for something much bigger than he could have imagined. And now, as he looked to the future, Marcus knew that, despite the challenges, there was hope. He and Thomas had planted the seeds for a better future, and that in itself was a victory.